Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sure some of you are asking, what would a liberal arts person have to say to an accomplished business professor? But when I thought of, when I first started talking to Amy, there were two things that I could see tied to what you all are here to talk about today. And the idea that was reflected in a book that came out a generation ago called The Big Sort, how people are sorting themselves out. And then it showed up in my class the last couple of classes when I asked students, what is beauty? And the biggest thing that came up, almost 90% of them, these are 18 and 19-year-olds, they are hungry for authenticity. Because it seems like no one is telling them, explaining them how to get to the real or what is real. And the other thing that they talk about is what does it mean to try and get a job in the YOLO economy? You only live once. That's their general attitude towards the contemporary economy or knowledge economy, whatever you want to call it. And I'm sure somebody as accomplished as you are, Amy, can kind of share with us, what does this mean? What does it look like in data?
It's a great question. And I think, thinking of the generations, one of the pressures that I'm sure many of you in the room are quite familiar with is how much people are looking for organizations, for leadership, for opportunities that feel like they connect them to a sense of mission and a sense of purpose that they can get behind and really care about, which puts a premium on organizations being quite authentic about what they are, who they employ and who they do not. And I think creates a bit of a different market than we've seen because we know that recent graduates are willing to trade off real income to join organizations that they feel they align with the purpose or the mission of, which is something that has always been a factor that people have cared about, but seems to be growing in importance with the countervailing forces of the economy and pandemic and everything else perhaps pulling in the other direction.
Okay. The next thing that shows up a lot of times in conversations with young people, they seem to be hungry for a sense of fulfillment. When I was young, a generation ago, you met a person you cared about or a future partner or spouse at church or through school or through other traditional ways of interacting with people. These days it's different. In terms of a former student of mine who's working on her doctorate now told me that she's uses something called Tinder. I don't know what that is. Because she's putting a lot of energy into her scholarship, and the pressure is almost worse on women because they're all the way want to get done by a certain time amount. So it puts pressures on how do I get to this fulfillment piece and how organizations can help me get to this sense of fulfillment.
I can't help you on the Tinder thing. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I do think this desire for fulfillment in work is something that perhaps people are wise to seek. So one of the things that I've studied for a long time now has to do with the kinds of relationships people have to their work. So do they see the work that they do as primarily a job where it's a means to an end, it's a financial relationship primarily, versus seeing perhaps the same work as more of a career where the focus is on advancement either within that organization or across organizations in a field, versus seeing the work as an end in itself, which we could call rather religiously or secularly a calling, where the work certainly pays money, perhaps there's advancement that comes with it, but it is primarily for the purpose of the work itself that people are there. And often people who see their work this way feel that the work contributes to the world, even if we would be hard-pressed to see how that job makes a contribution beyond just the work itself. And what's interesting, and perhaps where the wisdom is in seeking fulfillment through work, is we know from a number of studies that regardless of whether we're talking about people who work in very lofty occupations that require a lot of education and pay very well, or jobs that we might consider as being perhaps lower in the status hierarchy of a society from an education and income perspective, we find that people orient toward the work they do in each of these three ways. So whether we're talking about neurosurgeons, whether we're talking about laborers, and the relationships to how satisfied they are with their lives, how satisfied they are with their work, their experiences of well-being, their experiences of purpose and satisfaction in the long term are significantly different and are significantly better if they feel as though whatever it is they're doing in the work, they would do anyway if they hit, say, the lottery. I know there's a big Powerball or something on this week. The people who would keep showing up in some capacity because the work for them is something that means something beyond these other elements.
Okay. One of the things we chatted about briefly was the need for organization to redesign the boundaries of the workplace. What does that mean?
So one of the things that has happened in my research career is, because I'm interested in studying how people make meaning of their work and unraveling, if you will, and examining the relationships there, many organizations have come to me to say, well, this sounds great. Can you help us hire all calling-oriented people because they seem to be the happiest people and those are the kind of people that we want to have? And my response is always to say no, because if you look in, again, sort of other research that's been done, what we find is organizations can be quite good at hiring people who perhaps do feel called to the work that they're doing, and then find that calling for the work that they're doing in the organization gets stamped out over time by how the work is arranged in the organization, how the jobs are designed, how they're being led and managed, and so on. And so when I talk about or think about organizational boundaries, I feel that there's so much that can be done by managers, by supervisors, by leaders of organizations to spend a lot of time educating and helping people tap into what it is that the organization is trying to accomplish. Ultimately, what is it that they're responsible to the organization for? And then to give as much autonomy as possible for people to figure out the best ways in which to do that. That, I think, can help people tap into, again, the kinds of meanings that they're most seeking from the work they do.
One of the things to build on that, redesigning the boundaries, I think key things for Gen Z seems to be autonomy.
Yes.
They just want to know what the mission is, and then you give them the tools to finish the mission. But parallel that, this generation seems to be experiencing a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
And what I've discovered as an educator at the university level, a few years ago, I didn't know about this anxiety thing, what it was. But when I drilled down into it, it seems like people have not really told them what they need to know. And so they come with knowledge gaps. So when we're redesigning these boundaries, how do we help them cope with anxiety so they can do this autonomous work that they can get fulfilled in? How do we address those kind of things?
It's a terrific question. And I think everybody wants autonomy until you have too much.
Yes.
And once you have too much, it's paralyzing and it's terrifying. And it's particularly paralyzing if you're new to the job or you're new to the workforce or you're new to the organization and you don't know what you don't know, but you sense that it's perhaps quite a bit. And so I think the benefits to autonomy come only once people have a secure base of knowledge about what the work is that they're accomplishing for the organization, how things are done in that organization. And I would say one of the things that worries me quite a bit when I look at what's happening in the world of work and how much emphasis and desire there is for people to work in a hybrid way or have lots of remote working time is the people, and there's evidence coming out about this already, the people who I think are for whom this is the most costly, for whom it costs the most, are people who are younger and are newer to the organization or earlier in their career, because there's so much tacit knowledge and there's so much information, understanding what it is that the organization is trying to make happen and how that gets lost when people are not working together, which would just contribute to that sense of anxiety about not knowing what to do with the autonomy or how to get from A to B if you haven't traveled that path many times previously with your colleagues, with your supervisors, with your more senior teammates.
Okay, so now the autonomy, the anxiety, now we got to talk, I want to deal with the question of innovation. We hear a lot of things that are going to happen over the next several years related to AI, in my own profession, like this year, for the first time in the syllabi that we passed out, we had to give 3 options for AI or Chat GPT.
Yes.
You can use it unrestricted, or you can use it for brainstorming, or you can't use it at all. We go through training sessions on that. And so everyone seems to have this anxiety about AI. I mean, it even impacted the recent strike in the entertainment industry. So innovation just around that, because it's a disruptive innovation.
Yes.
How does that then be added to the mix? Because one of the things we chatted last time, it feels like for some of us that are in mid-career, we're on a highway and people who are probably should not be in the speeding lane are in the speeding lane and traffic is backing up. And we kind of wish they would retire. And so how do you do innovation with you're trying to deal with the emerging younger generation and then some people who should be in the regular right lane or in the left lane? How do you navigate innovation around these issues that are all converging at the same time?
There are days where I worry that we're all in that slow lane thinking we're going fast as we look at the changes that are coming down the pike with AI. You know, I do think it is an enormously transformative and disruptive technology in ways that we're only beginning to grasp. The closest complement I can think of is if you think of the digitization of other industries that have gone before, and the same kinds of conflicts came up, that you had kind of a ready generation that had a very deep understanding of all of the technological tools and bells and whistles and were very fluent in those, working with or potentially replacing people who had done it all in analog, if you will, and had come from a very different set of traditions and educations and so on in, for example, say media or newspapers or things like this, and you know, or even just in financial services. And so I think some of the more successful models for figuring out, you know, between just offloading the older generation, which I certainly wouldn't advocate, you know, versus ignoring the changes that are happening in technology, is to figure out how do you create partnerships, cross-training, cross-education between these younger folks and these older folks, because they have such different skill sets and knowledge bases that if it's structured well, if the incentives are right, if the culture is supportive of this, could end up in much better territory from the point of view of what their experience of work is like and what it is that they're able to produce on the basis of being interdependent with one another. Okay, now I guess to kind of put a bow on that, how do you get a small group to strategically plan and pull all this together? And the reason I'm asking from a liberal arts perspective, what you hear a lot of times, people who are kind of liberals are you hear the word, they throw around words like, oh, we're on the verge of the 1930s again, all this kind of stuff. But I was listening very closely to this one European scholar who I normally find annoying, but he was kind of right on it. He's saying, I think with this disruptive technology, we have to look at this as the same period when the printing press came out and they could start doing mass literacy. So he's saying we're not thinking in the right era. We got to think of Gutenberg's press when they start and making literacy, and then how it disrupted the politics. We have to start thinking of changes on that big of a scale that are happening around culture, politics, and economics. The growth of the G20, apparently in New Delhi it announced we're in a new world order now, multipolar. So we gotta like chuck everything I was taught in grad school. So, or reinvent our what we think about and how we think about the world. And we have to pull it together very swiftly. So are there any kind of frameworks that you can think of how you pull together in a small group, strategize people who might come from different backgrounds to set goals for an organization to achieve what we're talking about? So it is, I agree, it's an enormously disruptive change. You know, just around the AI, Chat GPT, and sort of all the rest, we've already gone into a phase with this where it's impossible to tell what's been created with this. And so we're both educators from that point of view, thinking about how do you work with this technology as opposed to trying to bar the doors from it that is no longer possible, does create transformative questions around education, around any of the industries that we're in. And I think if you're looking to motivate people who potentially from different backgrounds, different fields and so on to work together and to cooperate, the two most powerful things we know from psychology to do that is to give them a superordinate goal that they can only accomplish by cooperating with one another to achieve it, but a way to, in some sense, amp up the motivation to do that kind of cooperation is to give them a common enemy. To identify a common enemy that will wipe them all out. That can be another group, that can be a competitor, that can be a competitive environmental force that is not in the form of a person or a group that is threatening to all of them if they don't band together to try to solve that problem. That can be enormously motivating and quite effective at erasing boundaries between people from different groups who are trying to bring together in service of a larger goal.
But then the group would have to agree on what information is. Because I remember that's what COVID was. We thought it would rally the country. And I remember explaining to my family, I said, because I was in the Marine Corps, they gave us shots when we go out in the jungle or something. I said, hey, if the military is using it, we're going to take the shot. And I remember some of my friends on social media got angry at me when I showed taking the shot over at the university. And I was surprised that some people who I thought were whatever, they kind of revealed themselves around, I guess, the microchips in the medicine or some kind of stuff. So that was, so I think we'd have to then agree, what is information?
Yes. Well, on that note, I'm reminded of research that colleagues of ours not far from here over at Princeton have done that have quite effectively shown that when you're trying to change people's minds about something, telling them what the norm is or what other people, this is what we believe, is not nearly as effective as giving them information about what other people think the norm is, which sounds like a distinction without a difference, but it's really quite a powerful switch. If we say, no, this is the norm, people may reject that, but if they see evidence that most of the people around them feel that this is the norm, they will subscribe to that much more readily. So for example, this was utilized in trying to drive election turnout, telling people that most people don't vote, we really need you to vote, only got people to decide, well, I'm not going to vote because other people aren't voting. That's apparently the norm, as opposed to giving people information about how many of your neighbors are getting out there and voting. Clearly they agree and endorse the norm that we go out and vote, did much more to get people to turn out in higher numbers. So helping people get access to information about what others agree the norm is might be more powerful than going directly after what it is that we think they might normatively want to do.
Okay. And how much value in the midst of innovation, change, and strategic planning do you find with, say, community organizations who they don't know that they may need you, and some people who do what we do are unaware that we need them also? Yeah.
I mean, I think being in open conversation as much as we can be. I try, in my own research, I am at a business school, but a lot of the populations that I have sought to study are not sort of typical business organizations, in part because I think what we understand about work happens across a whole swath of contexts. So you and I had talked recently about one of the studies that I had done looking at the population of West Point cadets over a span of 10 years that had come into that institution and then following them for up to 14 years after that, to look at the question of how do the motives that draw people to do something, so to make the commitment to go to West Point, for example, but to join an organization or to go into a particular occupation, how do those motives and that mix of motives end up influencing the arc of their professional life and their affective experience of that life is something that cuts across big business, it cuts across nonprofit, it cuts across governmental and societal organizations as well. So I think keeping the conversation open is probably the best thing we can do.
And I know I wanted to also thank you for what you were talking about when we had that talk about the military. Like, I remember my grandfather was a small business owner in Mississippi, but he was a Korean War veteran. And so he had this network of people. I guess they probably didn't use the word what they would call social capital, because these younger generation, I don't think of them as being like civic minded like that in terms of belonging to, I remember when we were growing up, we'd hear about the Rotarians and all this other kind of people who were engaged with broader issues beyond their business. Yes. And I think that's some of the things that I see with the younger people. They don't know how to connect the dots, how all these things come together. Yeah. And I think I didn't see it as a young adult until I went to my grandfather's funeral and I saw all these strangers from different walks of life that were there to honor him. And I just thought he owned a landscaping business, but he had these Masonic people come in and people from veterans and all these other things when it showed up in the paper. And there was this huge turnout. So you didn't know, as a small business owner, had several employees, but I didn't know he was attached to this broader community of people.
Yes.
And that's kind of what I don't see in a lot of the dialogue from, say, the under 40 crowd around community engagement. Yeah.
I do think, personally, as I think about trends and how things are unfolding, that as organizations become, frankly, less and less work organizations where people are embedding for long periods of time or are constructing their identities and their primary memberships out of, in part because work is becoming so atomized, it's becoming more hybrid, more remote. The platforms on which people are working are changing to make them more distant from being full-time core members of their organizations in many industries. And so it puts pressure for a fundamental human need, which is to belong to a collective of some sort. If it's harder to satisfy in work organizations where it had traditionally been a major place that people took care of those needs, where else could those be satisfied? I wonder if there will be a resurgence of interest in community level organizations. It certainly doesn't seem to be redounding to the benefit of religious organizations in the US. And so where that is going to go, I don't think social media can hold it. It's not social enough. There's no community there. Becomes an open question. I hope it goes back to the community because I think communities desperately need it.
Okay. At this time, I don't know we're allowed for any questions. I know what you were just saying, that one thing, you don't have to comment on this. I know I had a student, an international student, who's terrified to go back to his country because they're aging so rapidly. And a lot of, until I started doing some reading about it a few years ago, they don't want to die alone because so many people, they're trying to figure, and this is in this native country of Japan. So that's why I think, so people are hungry for community and authenticity to be embedded within where they work and all this other, and they're trying to figure all this stuff out.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating set of puzzles, but finding community and sustaining community, I think, is some of the most important challenges that people have to solve in their lifetime.
Yeah.
Thank you.